December 1944. Ziegenberg Castle, Western Germany. In the underground bunker beneath the castle's ancient stones, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt studied the maps with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too many offensives and understood their costs too well. Around the table, younger generals radiated confidence that bordered on euphoria. "The Americans," declared SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, "lack the will for winter warfare. They are soft, comfortable. Their soldiers dream of home, while ours have been forged in the crucible of the Eastern Front." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, nodded his agreement. Intelligence confirms the Ardennes sector is held by Green divisions and exhausted units rotated for rest. They suspect nothing. The fog will hide our approach. By the time they understand what's happening, we'll be across the Meuse. Von Rundstedt said nothing. He had opposed this operation from the beginning. The plan was Hitler's fantasy, born of desperation rather than tactical reality. But the Führer had spoken, and field marshals did not contradict the Führer. Not anymore. Not after July's assassination attempt. Operation Wacht am Rhein. Von Manteuffel continued, his finger tracing the route to Antwerp on the map. "Will split the Allied armies. The British will be cut off. The Americans will panic. Churchill and Roosevelt will beg for terms." They still think we fight by the same rules, von Rundstedt thought, but did not say. They think courage and discipline can overcome industrial might. They think willpower can defeat logistics. Instead, he asked, "And what of Allied air superiority?" Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. "The weather," Dietrich responded immediately. "Fog, snow, low clouds, all forecast for the next week. Their bombers will be grounded. Their fighter bombers blind. We will have complete freedom of movement." It was, von Rundstedt had to admit, the one element of the plan that made sense. Without air cover, the Americans would be vulnerable. Without their artillery observers in Piper Cubs circling overhead, their defensive fire would be less effective. If the weather held, if surprise was maintained, if 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks could be moved into position without detection. If. "Gentlemen," von Rundstedt said finally, straightening to his full height despite the weight of his 69 years, "inform your division commanders. 0 hour is 0530, December 16th. Artillery preparation will last exactly 1 hour. Then the assault begins. Speed is essential. Antwerp must fall within 7 days." The generals saluted with the precision of the Wehrmacht at its finest. As they filed out, von Rundstedt returned his gaze to the maps. Somewhere across those colored lines and topographic symbols were American soldiers who had no idea what was coming. Young men who would die because old men had gambled everything on one final throw of the dice. May God forgive us all. December 15th, 1944. 2300 hours. Forward assembly areas, the Ardennes. The forest was alive with controlled chaos. Through the fog and darkness, an entire army materialized like a ghost conjured from Germany's desperate will to survive. Panzer V. Panthers and Tiger IIs emerged from camouflaged positions, their engines growling low as crews performed final checks. The tanks moved in disciplined columns, commanders navigating by shielded flashlights and whispered commands. No radios, no lights, absolute silence except for the inevitable rumble of steel treads on frozen earth. SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Schmidt stood in the cupola of his Panther, watching his company assemble with satisfaction. These were veteran crews, survivors of Kursk, of Normandy, of 100 desperate rearguard actions. They knew their trade. They understood that this might be their last chance to turn the war around. Hauptsturmführer, his gunner called up from below, the Americans truly suspect nothing? Nothing, Schmidt confirmed. Their reconnaissance flights see only empty forest. Their radio intercepts hear only routine traffic. They have concluded the Ardennes is too difficult for a major offensive. He allowed himself a cold smile. They are about to learn otherwise. Behind the tanks, columns of infantry marched through the darkness. The 326th Volksgrenadier Division, the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, elite units mixed with Volkssturm militia, experienced NCOs steadying teenagers conscripted from the Hitler Youth, all moving with purpose through the winter night. Feldwebel Hans Kruger, a veteran of 6 years of combat, checked his Kar 98 rifle for the 100th time as his platoon moved into position. Around him, younger soldiers whispered nervously. "Silence," he hissed. "The Americans are less than 2 kilometers away. Sound carries in this fog." Feldwebel, a private named Werner, asked quietly, "Is it true that we'll reach the Meuse in 3 days?" Kruger studied the boy, 17, perhaps 18 at most. Eyes still bright with belief in the fatherland, in ultimate victory, in the righteousness of their cause. He had seen too many such boys die to share their optimism, but he would not crush their spirit before battle. "We'll reach wherever our orders take us," he replied. "Now check your ammunition and stay close when the attack begins. The Americans may be soft, but their artillery is not." Artillery. Kruger had developed a healthy respect for American artillery over the past months. They had plenty of shells, endless supplies compared to Germany's dwindling stockpiles. And their forward observers were skilled, adjusting fire with devastating accuracy when they had clear observation. But in this fog, with surprise on Germany's side, perhaps the generals were right. Perhaps this would work. Or perhaps, a cynical voice whispered in his mind, we are throwing away the last of Germany's strength in one final, futile gesture. December 16, 1944. 05:30 hours. The Ardennes front. The world exploded. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front, their muzzle flashes creating a false dawn that lit the fog in shades of hellish orange and red. The bombardment was precise, methodical, devastating. The product of German military efficiency applied to the art of destruction. American positions vanished under the onslaught. Command posts, communication lines, forward observation posts, all targeted with intelligence gathered over weeks of patient reconnaissance. At 06:30, exactly 1 hour after the barrage began, whistles shrieked along the German lines. "Vorwärts! Forward!" The infantry surged from their positions, moving through the fog in assault waves that had been perfected on battlefields from Poland to Russia. Behind them, tanks rumbled forward, their commanders scanning for American defensive positions through the smoke and mist. Hauptsturmführer Schmidt's Panther crested a ridge, and through the fog he glimpsed scattered American vehicles attempting to retreat. Easy targets. His gunner fired twice. And 2 half-track trucks erupted in flames. "They're running!" his loader shouted. "The Americans are running!" Perhaps they were. Perhaps this would be the breakthrough the Führer had promised. Schmidt's radio crackled. Other units reporting rapid advances, minimal resistance, objectives falling ahead of schedule. The fog was holding. The Americans were caught completely by surprise. For a moment, one glorious moment, it seemed possible that the offensive might succeed. In the Ardennes forest, German soldiers advanced with confidence born of early success, pushing deeper into American lines. They moved like the army they had once been, unstoppable, inevitable, masters of mobile warfare. They had no way of knowing that in American artillery, batteries behind the lines, desperate officers were making decisions that would change everything. No way of knowing that even as they celebrated their initial victories, the future of warfare was being loaded into gun breeches and prepared for firing. The Wehrmacht was about to learn that courage, discipline, and tactical brilliance, all the virtues that had conquered a continent, meant nothing before the cold precision of science. The storm they had unleashed was about to be answered by thunder that thought for itself. December 16, 1944. 08:47 hours. Monschau, Germany. Feldwebel Hans Krüger had survived Stalingrad. He had walked through the killing fields of Kursk. He had endured the nightmare of Normandy's hedgerows and lived to tell of it. In 6 years of war, he had learned to read the language of artillery, the whistle that meant safety, the shriek that meant danger, the timing that told you when to press yourself into the earth and pray. None of that knowledge prepared him for what came next. "Einschlag!" his radio man screamed. "Incoming!" The familiar whistle split the air. Krüger threw himself into a foxhole, pulling young Werner down beside him. Around them, the platoon scattered with the instinct of veteran soldiers, seeking cover behind trees, in ditches, behind the burned-out hulk of an American Jeep. The shells arrived, but they didn't impact. Instead, they detonated 30 feet above the ground in perfectly synchronized airbursts that turned the sky itself into a weapon. The explosions came as white-hot flashes, each one unleashing a cone of steel fragments that swept downward in geometric precision. The sound was different, sharper, more terrible than conventional artillery. Not the crump of shells hitting Earth, but the crack of mid-air detonations, followed by the horrific whisper of thousands of metal shards slicing through air. "It's exploding in the air!" someone screamed. Krüger couldn't tell who through the chaos. "The shells are exploding in the air!" Werner's head simply ceased to exist. One moment, the boy was beside him, eyes wide with fear. The next, there was only a corpse slumping sideways, painting the foxhole red. Krüger scrambled out, pure instinct driving him toward a cluster of trees. Behind him, Corporal Schneider dove into a drainage ditch, the kind of cover that had saved Krüger's life a dozen times before. The next airburst caught Schneider in the open depression, fragments ricocheting off frozen ground and shredding him from above and below simultaneously. The trees offered no sanctuary. The airbursts detonated above the canopy, and steel rain penetrated downward through branches that might as well have been paper. Private Hoffman pressed himself against a boulder, seeking the solid protection of stone. The geometry of the airburst meant fragments struck him from 3 angles at once. The pattern of death was mathematical, inescapable. Hexerei! Witchcraft! They've made a pact with the devil! Krüger looked up through the chaos, a fatal mistake he couldn't help making, and saw it, the terrible beauty of synchronized detonations creating overlapping fields of fire in 3 dimensions. Each explosion bloomed like a deadly flower, petals of shrapnel extending in perfect cones. Where the cones overlapped, nothing survived. It was geometry made lethal. Physics transformed into apocalypse. His entire platoon, 37 men who had advanced confidently through the fog just minutes ago, was gone. Bodies lay scattered in patterns that defied traditional battlefield logic. Men killed in foxholes, men killed behind cover, men killed in positions that should have offered protection. Krüger staggered backward, his mind refusing to process what his eyes witnessed. Another salvo whistled overhead, and he ran like he had never run before, abandoning every tactical principle he'd learned, abandoning the advance, abandoning everything except the primal need to escape the killing zone. Behind him, the airbursts continued their perfect, terrible work. The Americans hadn't just improved their artillery, they had made it intelligent. And intelligence, Krüger understood with the clarity of absolute terror, was far more deadly than courage could ever be. December 16, 1944. 08:15 hours. Fire Direction Center, 406th Artillery Group. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson stood before the field telephone, his hand hovering over the receiver, frozen in the moment between obedience and insubordination. Through the canvas walls of the command tent, he could hear the distant thunder of German artillery and the closer chaos of small arms fire. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, outnumbered, outgunned, fighting desperately to hold the line at Monschau, was minutes from being overrun. "Sir," his fire direction officer, Captain Mitchell, said urgently, "the cavalry is requesting immediate fire support. They're reporting armor and at least battalion-strength infantry." "Conventional, he isn't stopping them." Axelson's gaze shifted to the locked ammunition bunker 50 yards away. Inside that bunker, guarded more carefully than gold, sat crates marked with red bands and serial numbers. Shells that officially didn't exist in ground combat roles. Shells that carried Eisenhower's personal prohibition against field deployment. In case of capture, the order read, German scientists must not be allowed to reverse engineer this technology. "Colonel," Mitchell pressed, "we need to respond now." Through the tent flap, Axelson could see his gun crews standing ready at their M1 55mm howitzers, the long toms that formed the backbone of American artillery. Good men, skilled crews, but good men with conventional ammunition couldn't perform miracles. He thought of the cavalry troopers dying in their foxholes. Young Americans who had crossed an ocean to fight tyranny, now being slaughtered because he was afraid to disobey orders. He thought of the court-martial he would face if this went wrong. The end of his career. Perhaps even a firing squad if captured shells led to American casualties down the line. He thought of the German tanks rolling through the gap that would open if Monschau fell, the domino effect of collapse spreading across the entire Ardennes front. "Unlock the special ammunition bunker," Axelson said quietly. Mitchell's eyes widened. "Sir, the standing orders?" "I'm aware of the standing orders, Captain." Axelson's voice carried the weight of a man who had just ended his career and didn't care. "I'm also aware that we're about to lose this position and every man defending it unless we use every weapon at our disposal." In that moment, obedience gave way to innovation. "Load VT fuses," Axelson commanded, using the code designation, variable time, that disguised the proximity fuse's true nature. "All batteries, prepare for fire mission." Mitchell saluted sharply and sprinted toward the ammunition bunker, shouting orders to stunned supply sergeants. Within 3 minutes, crews were loading shells they'd only heard rumors about. 130 electronic components packed into each fuse. Miniature radar systems that would survive 20,000 times gravity and calculate optimal detonation height 50 times per second. "Fire mission," the forward observer's voice crackled over the radio. "German infantry in the open. Coordinates." "Shot out," Axelson's battery commanders reported in sequence. As the big guns roared, the shells arced through the gray winter sky, spinning stabilizers keeping them true. Inside each fuse, glass ampules shattered on firing, creating batteries that powered infinitesimal radar systems. Radio waves pulsed downward, measuring distance to targets below. At precisely calculated heights, circuits closed. Detonators fired. And the geometry of warfare changed forever. Through binoculars, Axelson watched the airbursts bloom above German positions. Perfect flowers of destruction that swept entire formations from existence. The radio erupted with cavalry reports. "Enemy assault broken. They're falling back. What the hell kind of fire was that?" Axelson set down the binoculars with steady hands. He had violated direct orders from Supreme Headquarters. He had deployed the most classified weapon in the Allied arsenal without authorization. He had potentially compromised the technological advantage that might decide the entire war. He had also saved the line. And in saving it, he had opened Pandora's box. The proximity fuse was no longer theoretical. It was proven, and word would spread. Through command channels, through desperate requests from embattled units, through the unstoppable logic of battlefield effectiveness. "Captain Mitchell," Axelson said calmly, "prepare a report for General Eisenhower. Full disclosure. Include my recommendation for immediate deployment across all artillery units in the Bulge." Mitchell nodded, already writing. Axelson returned his attention to the maps, calculating the next fire mission. Whatever consequences awaited him, they would come later. Right now, there was a battle to win. December 23, 1944. 14:20 hours, above the Ardennes. Oberleutnant Franz Weber pushed his Focke-Wulf 190 into a steep dive, targeting the American artillery battery below. Behind him, 5 more fighters followed in attack formation. A rare appearance by the Luftwaffe, taking advantage of a brief break in the weather. "Engage on my mark," he transmitted. "For the fatherland." The sky erupted. Not with the familiar tracers of 50 caliber machine guns or the dark puffs of timed flak bursts. This was different. Air bursts detonating at their exact altitude with impossible precision, creating walls of steel fragments that anticipated their dive paths. Weber's wingman simply disintegrated, his fighter shredded by a burst that seemed to know where he would be. Weber pulled up hard, G-forces crushing him into his seat, but another airburst bloomed directly ahead. Fragments tore through his wing, severing control cables. The FW-190 tumbled earthward, trailing smoke. As consciousness faded, Weber understood. The Americans had taught the sky itself to fight back. In his field headquarters, General George S. Patton reviewed the after-action reports and wrote in his journal, "The fuse that sees, the fuse that thinks. The Hun believed courage could defeat machines. He was wrong." December 22, 1944. Night. Bastogne, Belgium. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was completely encircled. 7 roads converged on this crossroads town, and the Germans controlled every one. Inside the shrinking perimeter, paratroopers dug deeper. Ammunition ran low, and wounded men shivered in makeshift aid stations. But they weren't alone. Southwest of town, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes commanded the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit whose gunners had trained for this moment on segregated ranges back home. Now, surrounded alongside the white paratroopers they supported, the color of their skin mattered less than the accuracy of their fire. "Fire mission," the call came through. German armor and infantry massing for night assault. Barnes gave the order without hesitation. "Load VT, all batteries." The 155mm howitzers roared, sending proximity-fused shells into the darkness. At precisely calculated heights above the German formations, the shells detonated, brilliant white flashes that lit the frozen landscape like chain lightning. The airbursts never stopped. For 6 hours, the 969th maintained a ring of fire around Bastogne's perimeter, each detonation creating overlapping kill zones that shredded German assault waves before they could close with American positions. Paratroopers watching from their foxholes stood transfixed by the terrible beauty of it. The night sky alive with synchronized explosions, each burst illuminating falling snow and falling men in strobe light horror. "The thunder that never slept," one sergeant would later write. "The artillery that never missed." December 24, 1944. POW Interrogation Center. Obergefreiter and Klaus Richter sat across from the American intelligence officer, his hands still trembling. "We advanced in 3 waves, he said quietly in broken English. "Good soldiers. Veterans. Then the sky began to explode, not around us, above us, everywhere above us." He looked up, as if expecting death to rain down even here. "The shells could see us," he whispered. "How do you fight shells that can see?" The interrogator wrote quickly, noting the psychological impact. Around the room, other German prisoners told identical stories, voices hollow with the realization that courage meant nothing before such weapons. They had been beaten not by better soldiers, but by better science, and that defeat was absolute. January 18, 1945, 0230 hours, Sauer River, Luxembourg. The 2nd Battalion, 914th Grenadier Regiment, 702 men, approached the frozen river in disciplined silence. Their orders were simple: cross under cover of darkness, establish a bridgehead, hold until reinforcements arrived at dawn. Battalion Commander Major Ernst Hoffmann had chosen the timing carefully. The darkest hours before moonrise. American artillery observers would be blind. The fog rising from the river would provide additional concealment. His men descended the eastern bank in staggered columns, boots crunching on ice-crusted snow. Engineers went first, testing the ice, marking safe crossing points. Infantry followed in tight formations, too tight perhaps, but speed was essential. They reached the midpoint of the crossing. Then the American forward observers, equipped with new infrared detection equipment, called in coordinates. The first proximity-fused shells arrived 30 seconds later. The airbursts detonated in perfect sequence, 40 feet above the ice. Each explosion created a cone of fragments that swept downward with mathematical precision, finding men packed shoulder to shoulder on the exposed river surface. There was nowhere to dig in, no foxholes on ice, no trees for cover, no buildings to shelter behind. Just open space and geometry. The shells came in waves, methodical, relentless, calculated. Each burst illuminated the carnage below in stark white light. Men falling, ice shattering red, the carefully organized columns dissolving into chaos. Major Hoffmann died in the third salvo, his body torn apart by fragments that would later be counted and measured by American ordnance officers studying the fuse's effectiveness. The barrage lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, 702 German soldiers lay dead or dying on the ice. Not wounded, the proximity fuse's fragment pattern made survival statistically improbable for anyone in the kill zone. American casualty reports listed 0 friendly losses. General Patton would later write in his journal, "At the Sauer River, the enemy learned a final lesson. In modern war, courage cannot defeat physics. They had nowhere to hide, not in foxholes, not in forests, not even from the sky itself. The age of the brave soldier died that night on the ice. What replaced it was the age of the calculated kill." January 12, 1945, Wehrmacht Technical Intelligence Center, Berlin. Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann placed the captured American fuse under the examination lamp with hands that had once designed guidance systems for V-2 rockets. Around him, 3 senior engineers from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, leaned close, studying the device that had devastated German forces across the Ardennes. "Impossible," declared Oberingenieur Schmidt, picking up one of the miniature vacuum tubes with tweezers. "These components cannot survive the firing acceleration. 20,000 times gravity would shatter them instantly." Hartmann examined the circuit board, impossibly compact, with soldering joints no larger than pinheads. "The Americans claim these are production items, mass-produced at a rate of 40,000 per day." "Propaganda," Schmidt said flatly. "This is a plant, a decoy meant to waste our research time. These tubes," he held one to the light, "they're no larger than pencil erasers. Conventional tubes this size cannot generate sufficient power for radar emission." "And yet," Hartmann said quietly, "our soldiers report consistent airburst patterns, mathematical precision, detonations at optimal heights regardless of terrain. Coincidence. Preset time fuses adjusted by skilled observers." Hartmann set down his instruments and turned to face his colleagues. "Gentlemen, what if it's real? The silence that followed was broken by Schmidt's bitter laugh. Real? Doctor, we abandoned proximity fuse research in 1940. The Führer himself declared such weapons defensive technology unsuitable for a conquering army. We had the theoretical foundation. Professors Steinheil and Kramer published papers on radio proximity detonation in 1935. We could have built this. He gestured angrily at the American fuse. See, but we were ordered to focus on offensive weapons, V-2s, jets, wonder weapons that would win the war through shock and awe. His voice dropped. So we built rockets that missed their targets, while the Americans built fuses that never miss. Hartmann picked up the device again, turning it slowly under the light. Germany had possessed the scientific knowledge to create this weapon 5 years before America deployed it. They had the engineers, the theoretical framework, the industrial capacity, once, but ideology had trumped innovation. Offensive philosophy had dismissed defensive perfection. Now, German soldiers died by the thousands beneath American shells that thought for themselves. Killed by technology Germany could have pioneered but chose to abandon. The irony was as precise as the geometry of an airburst, and just as lethal. February 3, 1945, POW Camp Nancy, France. The barracks was cold, crowded, and filled with the bitter silence of defeated men. 50 German prisoners, soldiers, pilots, tankers, sat on wooden bunks, wrapped in thin American blankets, smoking cigarettes provided by their captors. Feldwebel Hans Kruger, one of the few survivors from the 326th Volksgrenadiers assault at Monschau, stared at his hands. They still trembled when he heard thunder. "I don't understand it," said a young panzergrenadier named Dietrich. "We had better tanks, better training. We fought for 6 years. We knew how to fight." "We knew how to fight men," said Oberleutnant Franz Weber, the Luftwaffe pilot who had survived his aircraft's destruction. His left arm was in a sling, his face still bearing burn scars. "But what we faced in the Ardennes, that wasn't men, that was mathematics." "The shells that exploded in the air," Kruger said quietly, his voice drawing attention. "I watched my entire platoon die. 37 men, veterans of Stalingrad, of Kursk, men who knew every trick of survival." He looked up, meeting their eyes. None of it mattered. The foxholes we dug, death rained into them from above. The trees we sheltered behind, death came through the branches. The ditches, the rubble, the rocks, none of it worked. "They made artillery intelligent," Weber added. "My squadron, 6 aircraft. We were torn from the sky like insects. The airbursts knew where we would be. They anticipated our maneuvers." He laughed bitterly. "We thought courage could stop machines." "We were wrong," finished an SS officer in the corner, his voice hollow. The words hung in the air, a confession that hurt more than any wound. Outside the barracks, 2 American guards, Corporal Jackson and Private Williams, stood at their posts, breath misting in the cold. They had heard everything through the thin walls. Williams, 19 years old and fresh from Iowa, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, is that what we did? Took the courage out of war?" Jackson, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, was quiet for a long moment. "No, son," he said finally. "We just made sure our boys came home instead of theirs." But his voice carried doubt. In the barracks, Kruger closed his eyes and saw again the airbursts blooming. Beautiful, terrible, perfect. The geometry of death rendered in fire and steel. He had survived 6 years of war, but he understood now that what he'd witnessed in the Ardennes wasn't survival. It was obsolescence. December 1944. Silver Spring, Maryland, 6,000 miles from the Ardennes. The factory floor hummed with purpose. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Under fluorescent lights that never dimmed, women in white coveralls assembled miniature vacuum tubes with tweezers and magnifying glasses. Rose Martinez, formerly a seamstress from Baltimore, soldered connections smaller than grains of rice. Her hands moved with precision, learned over 10-hour shifts. Connect, test, verify, pass to the next WWII station. She didn't know what these components did. Security protocols forbade questions. She only knew that soldiers' lives depended on her accuracy. Down the assembly line, Margaret Chen, a physics graduate denied university positions before the war, calibrated radar oscillators to tolerances measured in millionths of an inch. Each component had to survive 20,000 times gravity. A single faulty connection meant a dud shell. A dud shell meant American soldiers dying. No pressure was mentioned. None needed to be. While men fought in the snow, America's true army worked in light. At Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Dr. Merle Tuve studied oscilloscope readings at 3 a.m., his 7th consecutive night without sleep. Around him, physicists ran calculations, tested circuits, refined designs that would be in production by morning. The conveyor belts at RCA never stopped. Crossley Corporation ran triple shifts. General Electric retooled entire factories. 40,000 fuses per day, each one a miracle of miniaturization, each one tested, serialized, tracked. The Ardennes, concurrent. Colonel Axelson's batteries fired again. Shells, assembled by Rose's hands, calibrated by Margaret's mind, designed by Tuve's genius, arced through winter sky. Airbursts bloomed. German soldiers fell. The factory workers would never see the battlefield. The scientists would never witness their creations in action. The soldiers would never know the names of the women whose precision saved their lives. But the connection was absolute. From laboratory to factory floor to firing battery to target. American industrial might had been weaponized, not just tanks and ships, but thinking itself. Every fuse represented the collaboration of 100 companies, 1,000 workers, tens of thousands of hours. Germany had fielded better soldiers. America had fielded better systems. And systems, it turned out, won wars. Rose Martinez soldered another connection, unaware that at that exact moment, her work was saving lives in Belgium. The conveyor belt moved on. The war continued. And America's true weapon, the marriage of science, industry, and relentless production capacity, proved unstoppable. January 28, 1945, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General George S. Patton stood before a wall-sized map of the Ardennes, red pins marking the German retreat. The proximity fuse, Eisenhower said quietly, studying the casualty reports. Statistical analysis estimates it multiplied artillery effectiveness by a factor of 50. German formations simply dissolved. Patton nodded, his typical bombast absent. They came at us with everything. Discipline, experience, desperation. Hitler's best divisions. He tapped the map where the Bulge had been. We stopped them with science. Colonel Axelson's unauthorized deployment saved the line, Patton interrupted, and changed warfare forever. Eisenhower was silent for a moment. The Germans are in full retreat now, crossing back over the Rhine. The Bulge cost them 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, their last offensive capability. He paused. And their belief in themselves. Courage met calculation. Calculation 1. May 1946. Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C. The proximity fuse sat behind glass in a climate-controlled case, its miniature vacuum tubes visible through a cutaway section. A small placard read, VT Fuse, developed 1940 to 1943, deployed 1944, multiplied artillery effectiveness by 5,000%. Tourists passed by, barely glancing at the coffee can-sized device that had helped end the war. In a laboratory at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Merle Tuve worked on peacetime applications, medical imaging, radio astronomy, civilian electronics. The miniaturization techniques developed for killing would now save lives, explore the cosmos, birth the transistor age. Rose Martinez had returned to Baltimore, to a seamstress job that felt too small for hands that had assembled miracles. June 1947. War Museum, Koblenz, Germany. Feldwebel Hans Kruger stood before an exhibit of Allied weapons, his eyes fixed on a single proximity fuse mounted in a display case. A museum guard approached. "Interested in the American technology, Herr Kruger?" Kruger's hand trembled slightly as he pointed at the device. "So small, so innocuous. That's what ended us," he whispered. "Not their soldiers, not their tanks." His voice was hollow with understanding. "That? A coffee can filled with thinking glass and wire." The guard said nothing. Kruger stared at the fuse for a long moment, remembering the airbursts at Monschau, the geometry of death, the way entire platoons had simply vanished beneath intelligent artillery. "We thought courage mattered," he said finally. "We thought discipline and sacrifice could overcome anything." He turned away from the display. "We were soldiers from a different age. And that age ended in the Ardennes." The proximity fuse remained behind glass, small, silent, unremarkable. The weapon that proved warfare had evolved beyond warriors. The device that killed military romanticism as surely as it killed men. The future, it turned out, belonged not to the brave, but to the brilliant.